Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. We are covering breaking news out of the Supreme Court. It has decided that it will hear the case to decide whether former President Donald Trump is entitled to broad immunity from prosecution from special counsel Jack Smith, and previously requested the High Court to take up the issue. The court will hear arguments on the week of April 22nd. I want to bring in Major Garrett, who, of course, is our chief Washington correspondent. Major, good to see you. I know we've been waiting for this decision. Your takeaways on the Supreme Court deciding that they will hear Trump's immunity plea?
It is an important constitutional matter, one the court has never had to consider because no former president has ever been prosecuted or, in the terms of that prosecution, asserted to this highest court in the land that every activity undertaken during a presidency is absolutely immune from any second guessing or criminal prosecution federally. These are issues we've never had to grapple with. And the simple reason we're having to grapple with these is because the former president, while president of the United States, wouldn't accept the results of the 2020 election, lied about them relentlessly, and undertook an effort, which is now subject to federal prosecution, to overturn that election. We are here because of the actions and decisions undertaken about the 2020 election by the former president. We're not here for any other reason than that. And it is an important constitutional question, but it's being asked in a way that is in the backdrop of January 6th, an assault on the U.S. Capitol to delay the peaceful transfer of power because on that day we were to certify the electoral vote sent in legally and in a binding way by every state in the union. That, yes, all of this is extraordinary, but we cannot overlook why it is extraordinary. The singular act of a president to not accept the results of a legal, verified election and to deny his likely successor, his certified successor, his place in the American presidency through a peaceful transfer of power. That is why we are here. So, yes, it's an important constitutional question. The Supreme Court had a big choice. Does the Supreme Court take the rulings of a district court and an appellate court as the final word? I think it understood that popular perception of the Supreme Court is wavering, to put it gently. And because 3 of the justices sitting on this court were appointed under the Trump presidency, this court wanted to make sure this decision was reflective of the court that in some ways Trump created. So if it's negative against the former president, it's emphatic by his own hand-picked justices. No, you don't enjoy this absolute immunity, and you're going to have to go to trial. But the timing is astonishing. If there's a trial, Caitlin, as was just discussed in the special report, it will collide with the Republican National Convention in Michigan. It may bleed over to the Democratic National Convention in August in Chicago. And as we are living through this history, we are going to have to ask ourselves relentlessly, why did the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, wait so long to set in motion or to give the signal that a prosecution of this former president over January 6th and everything related to the 2020 election waited so long? Why? This collision is in part because of signals sent by the Justice Department. And it is colliding with the presidential election in a way that will test this country, its laws, its institutions, and its politics as never tested before. Yeah, I know we throw around the word unprecedented, but this is very true in this case, of course, and the way in which this has become a courtroom campaign for... It is, I think a better terminology is breathtaking. It will take the breath away of this country. And I want to bring in former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree, who joins us now. Tom, I thank you for being here. I want to get your thoughts on what Major just mentioned here, was just talking about here, the way in which the decision by Merrick Garland to take his time here in making a decision. What kind of impact has that had?
It has had a massive impact, and it will continue to have a massive impact as this whole saga plays out over the course of the summer. It's always been a little peculiar as to why the Justice Department and Merrick Garland waited so long to spur this prosecution on, to bring the charges, and to begin with this, because they knew that delays happen in criminal trials for one reason or another, particularly in a case of this magnitude. It was virtually certain that former President Trump would make an immunity defense, that immunity defense would then get litigated up through the courts of appeals, possibly to the Supreme Court. All the while, the trial court proceedings were put on hold. So they knew this was a possibility. And the fact that they didn't bring these charges until, a year or so, plus or minus, before the election meant that they were acting on a very tight timetable with virtually no margin for error. And now we're seeing as it's playing out, I think everything's going to be put in a very difficult position. Once the Supreme Court decides, it's going to be May or June at the earliest. And then the Justice Department will face the question as to whether they do want to push for a trial date before the election during the convention and during all the political windup.
And Tom, there is a set of guidelines within the Justice Department about decisions, both to prosecute, meaning to bring charges, or to press ahead as it relates to an election calendar. What are those guidelines, and how do you think they will manifest in this enormously public and consequential decision once the Supreme Court does issue a ruling?
Sure. The guidelines are a little bit hazy. The basic rule is that the Justice Department never wants to take action, and that would include bringing people to trial, filing charges close to an election in a way that potentially could influence the election. But it's not as though there's a specific calendar date in the Justice Department manual that says thou shalt not charge after such and such a date. It's a question of judgment. But here, it seems almost impossible to think that they could try to fit in a trial before you get into the full-on political season. As I said a minute ago, the Supreme Court is not going to decide this case until May at the earliest, and quite possibly not until June. There will then need to be at least a month or two or maybe 3 months of preparations in the trial court before you can begin the trial. You have to have pre-trial motions. You have to select a jury. There are all sorts of things that go into getting a case ready for trial. So by the time you're looking at the actual trial beginning, you're kind of talking early fall, which is, again, right in the heart of the political seasons. I think this would be a very difficult decision for the Justice Department to decide whether they still want to proceed with a trial before the election.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, too, because what kind of impact does this have on the underlying case here?
Yeah, well, the underlying case is going to remain apparently in a state of suspended animation until the Supreme Court decides whether former President Trump has immunity. If they decide that, well, he does have immunity, the case disappears. If, however, they decide that he does not have immunity, well, then presumably the engines will immediately restart in the district court. And there you're going to have that 2 to 3 to 4 month run up to a trial where the lawyers are racing around. They're getting their evidence ready. They're getting their witnesses ready. They're getting their trial preparations ready for what probably will be the trial of the century. Can't happen overnight. So you're just looking at a system that already builds in that several month process and pushes us right up until the cusp of the election.
Tom, could you evaluate for the audience the merits of the former president's assertion made by his attorneys to the court that absolute immunity is a real thing and should be basically accepted by the Supreme Court as an orientation toward not only power, but separation of powers?
It's a very, very aggressive argument. Certainly no court has ever accepted this argument before, this broad scope of immunity that former President Trump is claiming. I think that the government has a very good counter argument that recognizing immunity of this nature would threaten the separation of powers, that it would threaten our constitutional structure, and that it would elevate the president above the law. And the hypothetical you all remember from the appeals court argument where they said, well, if former President Trump is right, that presidents are absolutely immune, could a president order SEAL Team 6 to kill his opponent? Clearly, the answer to that is no. But that's a very difficult aspect for the former president in making this argument and trying to persuade the Supreme Court to go where it's never gone before and broaden and expand the scope of presidential immunity to encompass anything that the president does while he's serving in office.
And Major, I want to ask you a political question, which is, given what Tom said about what this does to the underlying case, I mean, the strategy from the Trump team has been to try to delay this as much as possible, right? Yeah. I mean, this is part of a bigger play here. I
mean, I'll leave it to Tom on the legal side of it, but just the jousting and the politics of the jousting in which the former president almost always finds himself on the better end of the spectrum, this is a victory. Any delay is a victory. Any delay, even by a day or two, is a victory. And this is not a day or two. Right. As we've laid out, this is several months. And the complications of having all of the former president's due process rights protected, as Tom laid out, they inevitably must be protected. In a high-profile case like this, all due process rights must be protected, but especially if the litigant is a former president of the United States, every benefit of the doubt is going to go to that particular high-profile defendant. The Trump team has known that from a legal strategic point of view, Every delay adjures to his benefit, not just legally, but politically. And now this case, if it follows the timeline that we have laid out, it seems almost impossible to carry out in the heat, the white-hot heat of a 2024 presidential campaign.
Exactly. Major Garrett, stick with us. And Tom Dupree, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your analysis here. And coming up, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is leaving his post in November as leader. What this means for the GOP, they're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. It was a big day of news on Capitol Hill today. There were major developments in the government funding fight, as well as Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He surprised us all on Capitol Hill, saying he will step aside from his leadership post this fall.
To serve Kentucky in the Senate has been the honor of my life. To lead my Republican colleagues has been the highest privilege. But one of life's most underappreciated talents is to know when it's time to move on to life's next chapter.
And this comes the day after former President Trump won yet another primary in Michigan last night. McConnell has still not endorsed Trump for a second term. On all three senators seen as the most likely to succeed him have, the most recent being Senator John Thune earlier this week. All of this while lawmakers face another government shutdown deadline this weekend. A lot to discuss. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins us now to discuss. Thanks so much for being here, Bob. I know there's a lot of breaking news today, but I do want to talk about McConnell because while this has been something that people have been speculating about for a while now, the fact that he is deciding to step down this fall from this leadership position, what does that say? What kind of message does this send as we're trying to assess where the Republican Party is right now as Donald Trump appears poised to become the nominee?
Caitlin, always good to be with you, and thanks for your collegiality today, helping us all out with us. We're all busy here at
Swapping
CBS
seats
News.
here.
Well, this is a seismic moment for the Republican Party. Mitch McConnell has been the leader for so many years, but he's not just the leader in terms of the official position. He's the leader of a value system inside of the Republican Party. Traditional Republican values, traditional conservatism. He has become, in a sense, an avatar for that wing of the party. And now with his move toward the exits, you're seeing the Trump wing of the party take almost total control of the congressional ranks of the party, as well as, of course, on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about that in terms of the policy that they're discussing now and what they're trying to put forward, especially when it comes to Ukraine funding, for example. I mean, he was kind of, the part of this relic of the Republican Party in terms of that. I'm wondering, what kind of impact that will have, especially as Trump is pushing a different message.
I've covered Senator McConnell for over a decade, and what's notable to me is that he's really a creature of the Senate. Not only is he a United States senator and a Senate leader, he began his career as an intern in the Senate in the 1960s, and he was an intern. He worked alongside the former Senator Lamar Alexander. They became close friends. So he is someone who has believed in the Republican Party over the years and has been through all of its evolutions. During Watergate, he notably broke with Richard Nixon to an extent. He was not exactly an enthusiast for Nixon during Watergate, which was notable. But he has become someone who's such a, as you said so well, an advocate for the U.S. presence in the world, for what many would call a muscular, traditional Republican foreign policy, where Republicans would advocate to have a major U.S. presence in Europe, in other continents around the world, instead of pulling back in that Trumpian fashion, America first, Trump calls his view of the world. And McConnell has always been a counter to Trump on a lot of these foreign policy questions, but he's accepted that the party's embraced Trump, and he's tried to live almost like sometimes when a couple gets divorced and they still live in the same house for some time as things are settled. That this has been a divorce for some time. McConnell and Trump have not really spoken since December of 2020, yet they've tried to have a functioning relationship to a point politically. But McConnell now is in the later stage of his career, and he's saying it's time for a new generation.
Yeah, I think that's such an apt metaphor here. And if we could kind of follow this through, it seems like, and as we've witnessed over the course of the past several weeks in the Republican primary, lawmakers have coalesced around Donald Trump and have been acknowledging that this is the marriage that they have to keep going at this point. I mean, I think it was really interesting that John Thune, the number 2 in leadership, endorsed Donald Trump this week. We are not yet sure about what the succession plan will look like. And of course, senators will have to make that decision. But what does that tell you about those vying to become the next leader of the Senate, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate?
Well, you can see on screen there, Senate, the Johns.
The Johns, yeah.
Thune is someone who's widely popular in the conference. Barrasso is seen as someone who's popular as well, more on the policy side. And Cornyn from Texas, he has his supporters. I think it's going to be a pretty competitive race. But the real question is, you look at what happened now with this government funding bill. Mm-hmm. They have an agreement to try to keep the negotiations going while the government remains open. They're going to stagger some of the appropriations. Some will go through March 8th. Some will then go through late March. So you see Speaker Johnson under so much pressure to do what the Trump rank and file want him to do. And so they've averted a government shutdown now. In this new statement out tonight, they say negotiators have come to an agreement, 6 bills across the appropriations that will make sure that the government remains funded, but it allows Speaker Johnson to still try to get what he wants on border security. And all of these government funding discussions are really indicative of what the Senate's going to face post-McConnell. You're going to have a Trump group that wants what Trump wants done. How will they handle it?
Yeah, and something that McConnell was very used to navigating. We'll see how his successor does that eventually. Bob Costa, always good to see you. Thanks so much for that analysis. And we will be following all of this news coming up. But we also have some other news. Former President Donald Trump and President Biden are both going to be in Texas tomorrow. What to expect from those visits? That's next. Welcome back to America Decides. As we've been reporting, the Supreme Court has decided it will hear the case involving former President Trump's request for immunity in the 2020 election case. We are also reacting to politics of the day out of Michigan for the former president and the current president. President Biden easily won last night's primary, but faced outspoken opposition from some in his own party. More than 100,000 Democrats in the state voted for uncommitted to rebuke the president over his handling of the Israel-Hamas war. And tomorrow, both Biden and Trump will be at the southern border. The president will head to Brownsville, Texas, and Trump will deliver remarks in Eagle Pass. So for more on all of this, let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Bo Erickson, who is joining us from Brownsville, Texas. Bo, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here. I do want to start with Michigan, however. How did the Biden campaign respond to this result of uncommitted, this protest vote? Are they acknowledging it?
Yeah, we actually heard directly from President Biden in a campaign statement last night, and he credited his win in Michigan to issues like abortion rights and what we're seeing with in vitro fertilization, the conversation around that. And he also said kind of rallying his Democratic supporters against former President Donald Trump. But I will note in the statement that he released last night, Caitlin, it was 327 words, and it did not include the word Gaza. It did not include the word ceasefire. It did not include the word Palestine. And so that kind of was a little bit of a tell that they weren't acknowledging those 100,000 votes that they received last night. Talking to people close to the campaign today, they said that those 100,000 votes in totality should be a lesson for the campaign. And we're also hearing that from allies of President Biden's as well. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, who's very close to President Biden. He said on Capitol Hill today that he thinks the 100,000 votes are sending a signal to voters and to the president that they disagree with the president's policy.
Yeah, Bo, I had the same exact reaction you did, and I was going through all of those statements trying to find those same words and couldn't find them. But it'll be interesting because it seems like they are trying to push this as, well, this is the decision between Biden and Trump, and that's your choice in November. We'll see. Meanwhile, let's talk about politics of the day and why you are there at the border. I know you spoke with a Border Patrol union leader about Biden and Trump coming tomorrow. How are agents responding to these visits by the current and former presidents?
Yeah, we spoke to Chris Cabrera, and he is one of the leaders of the Border Patrol Union. He's been in the Border Patrol for 22 years, and he came to talk to us right here on the border between Texas and Mexico. And he said both former President Donald Trump and current President Joe Biden, they should kind of remove some of the political framing from the immigration issues. And we can actually hear from Mr. Cabrera now.
I think they both have different agendas. I know President Trump is doing it as a part of his campaign. I'm not certain why President Biden is coming down. Don't get me wrong, it's welcome that he's coming. However, I think if he was here to address this crossing issue, I think San Diego or Tucson, Arizona would have been a much better spot so they could see the actual numbers that are coming in. I think, yeah, it's unfortunate that this whole thing has gotten as politicized as it has.
And just putting some context on those numbers, Caitlin, what he means there is that those uptick of migrant crossings, those illegal migrant crossings that we saw last year, those were happening in places like here in Brownsville, Texas, where President Biden will be, and where former President Donald Trump is tomorrow, about 300 miles west in Texas. What Mr. Cabrera is saying, though, is that a lot of the crossings now are happening in Arizona and California. And so he was trying to make the point that if the President Biden wants to kind of hit the current issue, he maybe should go west. One other interesting thing that talks about maybe some progress being happened is that Mr. Cabrera, who runs this area of the Border Patrol, at least represents them in the union, he said that there were only 12 apprehensions yesterday for illegal crossings compared to hundreds or thousands last year.
Bo, that's really interesting. I do want to pick up on a point that you just made about how Biden and Trump are going to be hundreds of miles apart, even though they're both visiting the border. As it pertains to President Biden, what exactly does he have planned for his visit?
We expect him to meet with local officials here and also some Border Patrol agents, and we expect him to kind of bring up that Senate negotiated border bill a few weeks ago that people may remember. There was both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate supporting very strong border security measures that would give more money for border security and also tweak and kind of clarify aspects of the asylum process. However, that did not go through because former President Donald Trump said he did not support the plan. So House Republicans then also did not support the plan, and therefore the plan went away. So President Biden is trying to kind of flip the script tomorrow on former President Donald Trump to go on offense on this issue because this is the #1 issue for a lot of voters all throughout the country.
Yeah, Bo, on that point, I mean, I just kind of want to take a step back and kind of think about the political nature of this visit. The fact that Biden has been under pressure for a while now to visit the border. And you and I both know, covering the campaigns, that this is, top of mind for many voters across the country. How much of this is kind of acknowledging that political pressure?
I think this is a lot of acknowledging the pressure. This is the president's second trip while in office. His first trip was more than a year ago to the other side of Texas. And now we can kind of see that the president does feel the need to be responsive to this and talk about campaign promises versus actually what happens in the White House. The White House and the president are now considering restricting the asylum process and limiting asylum claims for only migrants that cross at legal ports of entry. So asylum, if this is enacted by President Biden, would not be granted to migrants if they cross illegally. And just to show what a dramatic change this would be from President Biden's campaign pledge, right before he took office, he said that he was going to reassure the asylum process and kind of reinvigorate it and stand by it. In fact, his wife, First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, was right across the Rio Grande River, right behind me, during the campaign, and she said that President Trump didn't have compassion for asylum seekers and that we need to be welcome to asylum seekers. So now, about 3 years later, in the run-up to the November election, we are hearing almost a completely opposite idea, potentially coming out of the Biden White House. To be sure, though, Caitlin, it is not clear yet if President Biden will go through with this change.
Very interesting context and reporting. Bo Erickson, as always, thank you very much for your time, and we'll continue to follow that visit. Next, the latest on the Supreme Court decision regarding former President Donald Trump's efforts to argue immunity in the 2020 election case. You're streaming CBS News. Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Thanks for staying with us. We are following breaking news out of the Supreme Court. The justices have agreed to decide whether former President Trump is entitled to immunity from federal prosecution in the 2020 election case. I do want to bring in CBS News campaign reporter Katrina Kaufman joining us now. She's also an attorney. I know, Katrina, you have been covering all of the Trump cases here. So can you kind of put this into context for our viewers here who are often faced with the challenge of trying to keep track of everything going on the legal front for Donald Trump? We were just talking with Major and Tom about kind of the timeline here and how this collides with other cases that Trump may be facing, and of course with the underlying January 6th case. But what other cases are kind of on the horizon, and does this interfere with any of those?
Hi, Caitlin. So yes, we have coming up the first criminal trial that's going to be prosecuted against Trump, which is the hush money case here in New York. That's going to be March 25th. And originally, this D.C. trial was supposed to be in early March. It was scheduled for March 4th. But what's happened with this immunity issue has just pushed that, as we see. And now, by my calculations, I think that case probably couldn't start until September if the Supreme Court allows it to go ahead. And that could actually put it in conflict with the Georgia case, because Fani Willis was looking to have that start on August 5th. So that would potentially put these two trials in conflict. There's a lot of stuff going on with Fulton County as well to see how that case is going to proceed. But that's what comes to mind first when I think about the intersection of these cases at this moment.
And Katrina, I know we're kind of every day on watch for some kind of decision here, but I'm curious too about your general takeaways from the Supreme Court deciding to take up this case.
I was a bit surprised. I think the fact that it took them so long to make a decision about this, I was under the impression that perhaps they were going to deny it. Someone was writing an opinion, but it looks like the Supreme Court wants to weigh in on this, and it makes a lot of sense. This is an issue of first impression. It's a major constitutional issue, and the Supreme Court really should consider it.
Katrina, thank you very much. Major, I do want to talk. Oh, can I? Okay, thank you. We're rolling here. I do want to talk just a little bit again about the politics here, because
Sure.
We've both been on the campaign trail a lot over the past several months.
Right.
And when you go to rallies for the former president, when you talk to voters, this is very much on their minds in terms of them lumping together all of those cases that Katrina just described,
Yes.
and trying to cast everything as political. And to your point about the strategy involved in the legal front being a political strategy too,
Right.
the way in which this has not only endeared his supporters to him, but has, kind of, the more information comes out, the more they feel impassioned for him.
And let's just focus on the January 6th case, this particular case, because this is what the Supreme Court is being asked to decide, only in the context of this case. This is not a decision that has any bearing on the documents case or any other, only on January 6th. And you know this and I know this, but I want to share it with our audience because it's very important to understand the underlying politics and Trump's relationship to his supporters. They look at this and say the following. The Justice Department didn't do anything. Then the January 6th Select Committee, which many Trump supporters regard as a partisan maneuver. Two Republicans who were anti-Trump on that committee working with Democrats did this investigation, which they regard as kind of an elaborate TV program meant to get the former president. I'm not validating any of this, but this is how they view it. And then the January 6th committee makes its recommendations, and then and only then, according to Trump supporters, does the Justice Department kick in gear. So the way they digest that is Nancy Pelosi created a committee filled with hard Democrats and 2 anti-Trump Republicans, produced evidence and a report, and then and only then. So it's basically Nancy Pelosi kicking this over to the democratically led Justice Department under Joe Biden, who brings these charges, and that's why we're here. Skipping over entirely what Trump did and lies about the 2020 election. This is why for this case, which is a super important case, not just this defendant, the former president, but the American presidency, Trump supporters just see it as another partisan maneuver. And that story, that narrative for themselves doesn't budge. You've heard it. I've heard it. And you have all these other intervening factors, the Supreme Court and legal appeals, and all, they've already decided this. Right. And so now they look, hey, this trial could be right up again, or maybe not even held at all. See, our guy wins again, no matter what. They can't get him. No matter what they do, they can't get him because he's smart enough, tactical enough, he can maneuver around it, and we're going to have the election on our terms. That's how, I guarantee you, that's how this is being interpreted moment by moment this afternoon across the country and among those who are Trump-supporting Republicans. A lot of other Americans will look at this and say, wow, Supreme Court could have read that 57-page appeals court ruling and said, you know what, they got it right. Yeah. The law, every underlying case, all precedent, all history, done. Mr. Former President, you don't have it. And they could have made that determination several weeks ago. Right. But no, the weeks and weeks and go on. Now they say, no, we're going to weigh in. And they have to know. They are not immune from the larger political conversation in this country. Supreme Court knows by waiting this long and now pushing into April, they've made this trial, however it decides, almost untriable in this calendar year. Not impossible, but very difficult. And even if it is held, it will reinforce all of these underlying things we've talked about, suspicions, aggressions, grievances, the Trump supporters and the Trump legal team and the former president himself not only has, but will continue to have about this particular case. And a lot of those sentiments have been fostered by Republican rivals who have not criticized Trump on this at all and kind of helped to create that scenario as well. And look, there are plenty of fair-minded Republicans who say, you know, maybe this particular question about what the former president did in office and January 6th is best handled by the next election in a political context only. Don't prosecute him over it. Let's see that he's defeated for a bid for re-election, and that would end it. That is an interpretation that even some Republicans who are not adoring of the former president hold. But that ship has sailed. This is a prosecuted case. He's indicted. The Supreme Court will decide whether or not he or any future occupant of this office has absolute immunity or not. But even if it decides you don't, and you've got to go to trial, the practical schedule of that trial now is enmeshed with the presidential campaign, and therefore may not go ahead. Yeah, collision course indeed. Major Garrett, as always, thank you very much for sticking with us. And Hunter Biden was on Capitol Hill today answering questions from lawmakers in the impeachment inquiry today. His message to Republicans, that's next. Hunter Biden testified before the 2 House committees leading the impeachment inquiry into President Biden today. CBS News investigative reporter Erica Brown joins us now. Erica, I know you were following all of this on Capitol Hill today. Tell us what happened today. What did we learn from Hunter Biden in this case?
Well, Hunter Biden appeared behind closed doors for this deposition. This comes months after they negotiated the terms for his appearance. He initially wanted it to be public. But today, he reiterated that President Biden had no direct involvement in his business dealings. He also acknowledged his addiction to drugs and said that he had made some mistakes, but that this impeachment inquiry, in essence, he dismissed as a partisan political pursuit of President Biden. He said it was based on conspiracies, but nothing new came from this testimony that linked President Biden to his family's business dealings. And we also learned from the chair of the House Oversight Committee that they intend to, despite this deposition, intend to continue to pursue investigative leads that they say will connect the president to egregious activity. And so they plan to have a public hearing. That's something we learned new today, a public hearing, which is what Hunter Biden initially wanted. A public hearing with Hunter Biden. They also plan to issue subpoenas for more financial records and also plan to continue to pursue this investigation to get to the bottom of what they say was a public corruption scheme involving President Biden. But so far, his testimony hasn't yielded any new evidence to implicate the president.
Okay, very interesting. We'll wait for that public testimony. Erica Braun, thank you for covering for us, and we'll follow your reporting. Thanks for spending the hour with us. You're streaming CBS News.